Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. Across the events and individuals that we have explored over the last few years on this channel, the topic of treason has come up fairly frequently. We have looked at the stories of many individuals who, having been judged and found guilty by a jury of their peers, went to the scaffold to be executed for their crimes. However, there have also been a few who were punished in this same way without the opportunity of going to trial. Today, we're going to look at some of these tales and the process that made their punishment possible. But before we take a look at today's topic, I want to say an absolutely massive thank you to History Hit for sponsoring another video on this channel. History Hit brings you the stories that shaped the world through their award-winning podcast network and online history channel. It's like Netflix, but all history. With History Hit, you can watch hundreds of hours of original history documentaries anywhere, anytime, on any device. Brought to you by expert historians such as Dan Snow, Professor Susanna Lipscomb, Dan Jones, and more. In addition to already having hundreds of expert-led programmes, they add 2 more every week. History Hit also launch 19 new episodes weekly across 8 podcasts, which includes the world's leading history podcast, Dan Snow's History Hit. As we hurtle towards November, I decided to get into the historical headspace of Bonfire Night by watching Guy Fawkes, the Yorkshireman behind the plot, and by doing so, getting a fascinating insight into the background and circumstances of the man who conspired to blow up the king and his parliament in 1605. Click the link in my description box to find out more and to subscribe to History Hit. As an added bonus, my viewers are able to get 50% off your subscription for the next 3 months by using code READINGTHEPAST. Thanks again to History Hit for sponsoring this video. Now, let's look at those who are punished as traitors without a trial. Across the centuries, numerous acts or bills of attainder have been enacted. Far too many for me to detail here. Today's video is rather intended to be an overview of the process, a look at its purpose, and at relevant moments, an exploration of some key examples. It will not be a comprehensive list of every attainder ever issued because, frankly, that's going to be about as exciting as me reading the phone book and would probably take me just as long. So, disclaimer issued, let's proceed. In the Oxford English Dictionary, acts or bills of attainder are defined as, quote, the legal consequences of judgment of death or outlawry in respect of treason or felony, viz., forfeiture of estate real and personal, corruption of blood, so that the condemned could neither inherit nor transmit by descent, and generally extinction of all civil rights and capacities. The second of these was looked upon as the essence of attainder, which is defined by the lawyers as the stain or corruption of blood of a criminal capitally condemned, the immediate inseparable consequence by the common law on the pronouncing of the sentence of death. Treason was understood to be a criminal offence that deprived the person convicted of it of their life, in addition to any lands, properties, and titles they may have held. By being convicted of the same, a person was deemed to have been attainted. Their crime had tainted or stained them, their legacy, and their descendants. For this reason, the heirs of traitors were disinherited, unless a monarch was determined to be merciful and reinstate them. With all this in mind, I think it's fair to point out that sentencing following a conviction alone could, perhaps should, have been enough to achieve the justice and security that might have been sought by the state, government, monarch, etc. So why the need for this act or bill? Why involve Parliament in the matter at all? It has been argued that the parliamentary attainder originated in the orders for the exile of first Piers Gaveston in 1308, and then the father and son duo of the two Hugh Dispensers in 1321, that were both issued by Parliament. The reign of King Edward II was beset by problems, with the threat of civil war being a near constant presence. Piers Gaveston was this king's first despised favourite, and at the Parliament of April 1308, a substantial number of Edward's nobility presented, while heavily armed, 3 articles that they said proved the need for Gaveston's exile. The king was understandably left with little option but to submit to their demands on the 18th of May. However, he would soon be seeking a way to bring his Gaveston back to him. To do so, the king was going to have to override his parliament and also the threat of excommunication that had been pronounced upon Gaveston by the Archbishop of Canterbury on the 24th of June. Gaveston would be in and out of exile until he was ultimately seized by his enemies and then executed on the 19th of June 1312. Around 9 years after this beheading of Gaveston, Parliament would be working against 2 more hated favourites of King Edward II. Now, it was going to be the turn of the Despensers. On the 4th of May 1321, the anger towards the Despensers boiled over into action, because on this day, infuriated nobles began to ravage the lands that belonged to this despised family. Then, in the August of the same year, 1321, those lords who opposed the Despensers' place, prominence and power met King Edward II in the Parliament and laid out their charges against his favourites before him. Backed into a corner and outnumbered, the king agreed to exile the Despensers on the 14th of August. And then, 6 days later, on the 20th of August, 1321, Edward pardoned those who had engaged in the earlier violence. Just as with Gaveston, the king would soon have the Despensers' exile overruled and annulled too. War would break out. Ultimately, the Despensers would end up being executed within a month of each other towards the end of 1326. The king would be forced to abdicate at the beginning of the following year, 1327. But if we set that aside and return to thinking about the exiles ordered by Parliament, in the cases of Gaveston and the Despensers, they were not, seemingly, subject to any judicial process or judgment in the Parliament itself. Complaints against them were presented, they were seemingly accepted without the option of a defence, a sentence was then issued, and the king was encouraged to consent to it. For many scholars, these examples are foundational to, or indeed a blueprint for, the acts and bills of attainder that would come to pass in later periods. Indeed, J.G. Bellamy explains that, quote, Parliament was the scene of most of the state trials and faction battles of the 14th century. Initially, the punishment was part of the judgment in Parliament, but after Richard II's revenge against Gloucester, Arundel and Warwick in the session of 1397-8, the judicial process almost disappeared and the pronouncement of penalty came to stand by itself. This was the Act of Attainder. The period of evolution came to an end in 1459, when the Yorkist leaders were prescribed by Act of Parliament, without, or so it seems, any previous judicial process. Those who were the victims were not given the opportunity to answer, but had to watch from afar while they were condemned as traitors and their heirs disinherited. A fashion was set, and until the end of the century, the king de facto periodically prescribed his enemies in this way. The brother of King Edward IV, George, Duke of Clarence, was convicted of treason against his brother and king at a specially summoned and managed Parliament at the start of 1478. He was duly the subject of an Act of Attainder. He would be executed by secret means in the Tower of London within days. And as he had been attainted, his heirs were disinherited. And for this reason, it is said, they were not considered as heirs to the throne in 1483, after Edward IV's death and the declaration that his children were unable to rule as they had been born out of wedlock. Had George not been attainted then, by the custom of male preference primogeniture, his surviving son would have had the superior claim to the throne than George, Duke of Clarence's younger brother, Richard. But as it was, the Attainder nullified that claim, and so Richard ascended to the throne as King Richard III. In the uncertain and violent times of the so-called Wars of the Roses, acts of attainder were a useful way to legally determine someone to be a traitor, even if you couldn't put them on trial. And with individuals hopping on and off of the continent as their fortunes and monarchs shifted and changed, it's going to be nigh on impossible to, firstly, scoop up all your enemies, then put them on trial as traitors, secure their conviction, and execute them so you could take all of their lovely lands and titles, then disinherit their heirs if they had them. So I think we can see how the ability to attaint someone in Parliament, which doesn't require their presence or the protracted process of a trial in absentia, I think we can see how that's going to be appealing. I mean, sure, you're not going to be able to execute them unless you can get hold of them, but what you could do is seize everything of theirs that's still in the country, and then you can either use it to fill your own coffers, or you can hand it off to someone whose loyalty you actually wish to reward. As the throne switches back and forth, old attainders can be reversed and new ones can be issued, as the traitor mantle passes to those who are supporting the, currently at least, losing side. It was also in the monarch's gift to reverse an attainder, perhaps following the extraction of a promise of loyalty going forward. In some cases, as in the reign of King Henry VII, these promises of good behaviour in the future would be accompanied with the payment of fines and or a requirement to agree to a bond that would mean that they lost absolutely everything if they misbehaved again. King Henry VII's son and successor, King Henry VIII, would, it would seem, come to be a big fan of executing people as traitors under Acts of Attainder. Now, we're going to look at just two examples of how these acts were actually used during his reign. Elizabeth Barton, who was known for a time as the Holy Maid of Kent, claimed to be the recipient of messages directly from God. As the King's matter was getting underway and hotting up, Barton's God-given prophecies increasingly carried warnings for the king of the damage that would be done to himself and to his rule if he continued down his current path. Barton enjoyed a growing audience, individuals who were receptive to her message and who, in many cases, were both willing and able to support her and her convent financially. In 1533, Barton was questioned on a couple of occasions, before ultimately being arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Once she was there, she was again interrogated, and eventually, perhaps because she was now separated from her spiritual advisors and those who were encouraging her, now her resolve collapsed. She confessed herself to be a traitor and heretic. She was forced to do penance at Paul's Cross in London. As her position on her prophecies collapsed, so too did her public support and influence. Barton and her accomplices were utterly routed, and so I would say that the threat that they posed was almost totally removed. Nevertheless, in March 1534, Barton and her accomplices were subject to acts of attainder, either for treason or for misprison and concealment of treason. Barton was executed on the 20th of April 1534. This case, however, also provides us with another potential benefit of the Acts of Attainders, and the fact that they were things that required the parliamentary process. Because this Act of Attainder of 1534 called upon the public to surrender any books, scrolls, or other writings about the revelations and miracles attributed to Barton and her adherents on pain of imprisonment and the imposition of a fine. While condemning Barton and her known adherents, this Act of Attainder, as is the case with so many other acts or bills that pass through the Parliament, includes a legal change. Namely, the new illegality of holding on to any writing specifically connected to Barton, her treason, or her heresy. The second example of an act of attainder that was used during the reign of Henry VIII that I wish to look at also connects to a change in the law. This act of attainder was introduced into the House of Lords on the 21st of January 1542. It sought to condemn Henry's fifth wife Catherine Howard and her companion Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, as traitors. The King's assent would be given in absentia by letters patent on the 11th of February 1542. The legal change that emerged was arguably actually required in relation to this attainder, because while the Treason Act of 1351 announced, among other things, the culpability for treason, quote, if a man do violate the king's companion, wife, or the king's eldest daughter unmarried, or the wife of the king's eldest son and heir, I think the wording here is clear. It is the man who is the traitor, not the queen or the princess. And so, with this in mind, how is it that Catherine can be attainted by Act of Parliament as a traitor for her alleged adultery and so-called inappropriate or immoral sexual conduct before her marriage? Well, the Act that sought to convict Catherine and Jane stipulated that any future queen who failed to disclose her unchaste past would be guilty of treason, and that any others who knew but remained silent about such illicit behaviour would be guilty of misprison of treason. It is recorded as follows, quote, to avoid doubts in future, it is declared that the royal assent given by commission shall be valid in all cases hereafter, that any likeness of the Queen for the time being may be revealed to the King or his council, and that an unchaste woman marrying the King shall be guilty of high treason. On the 13th of February 1542, first Catherine and then Jane climbed up onto a scaffold that had been erected for the purpose within the complex of the Tower of London. One after another, the women were beheaded. The bodies of Catherine and Jane were buried within the chapel of St. Peter Advincula straight away. This was the same place as Catherine's cousins and Jane's husband and sister-in-law, George and Anne Boleyn, had also been buried. Like Catherine Howard, Anne Boleyn had also been Henry's wife and queen before she had been named as a traitor and then executed back in 1536. Anne's conviction and sentence, like that of her brother and the other men accused alongside her, was pronounced at a trial. And some have suggested that Henry was embarrassed by particular moments in these trials, moments that impugned his virility and his sexual prowess. And additionally, the whole rigmarole and process does seem to have done precious little to convince people of Anne's actual guilt. I mean, even Eustace Chapuis, who would refer to Anne Boleyn throughout as the whore or the concubine, appeared to be seemingly incredulous when he was writing to Monsignor de Granvelle that, quote, the king has been heard to say that he believes that upwards of 100 gentlemen have had criminal connection with her. You never saw a prince or husband show or wear his horns more patiently and lightly than this one does. I leave you to guess the cause of it. Presumably, Chapuis is inferring that these horns sit so comfortably because they are nothing more than a costume for King Henry VIII, that he knows he has not really been cuckolded. The situation with Catherine Howard was seemingly quite different. For a start, she had confessed to being unchaste when she married Henry, and it is said that he felt pretty embarrassed to have so misjudged her. Also, Henry's older now, fatter, more infirm, and so perhaps all of that combines to make him even more keen to avoid being shamed by any evidence that might be presented at Catherine Howard's trial. Perhaps Henry saw the Attainder as the way to go because it allowed him to prescribe the behaviour of future queens, even premaritally. Did Catherine's confused and changing confession raise the stakes further, make the chance of embarrassment seem higher, and thus cause an act of attainder to be viewed as being preferable to going forward with a trial? As Catherine's destruction was getting underway, Jane Boleyn began to show signs of profound mental distress, and I hope this is pretty understandable, considering that she is being held culpable too. She was so unwell that Henry allowed her to recuperate at Lord Russell's home. He even sent his physicians to care for her. Before we go think of this as an act of kindness, we must remember that executing a person who had been determined to be insane was a big no-no. Henry was looking to get her better so he could execute her sooner. And perhaps Jane's mental instability also makes avoiding a trial preferable. I can see how the stress of her being confronted with the charges against her in public might serve to destroy whatever recuperation had actually occurred. And if that happened in public at a trial, then there are going to be witnesses to her descent into insanity. It cannot be denied. This is either going to have to forestall her execution, prevent it entirely, or, if it then goes ahead afterwards, make Henry look really bad. Nevertheless, to be extra sure, Henry also changes the law. An Act is entered into the Parliament roll on the 16th of January 1542, which required, quote, due process to be had in high treason in cases of lunacy or madness. Do let me know why you think that these acts of attainder seem to have so appealed to King Henry VIII. But we aren't done yet. In 1660, King Charles II was restored to his executed father's throne, and in the same year, an Act of Attainder was created against the regicides. This was the name given to the group of people who were deemed to be implicated and guilty in killing the king. This Act of Attainder affected those still living in England, those who had fled, and those who were dead. They were to be attainted as traitors, executed, their land seized, and their heirs disinherited. Among the dead regicides was Oliver Cromwell. Like the other deceased members of his faction also attainted, Cromwell was posthumously sentenced to be disinterred, taken to Tyburn, hanged, and then beheaded, although some say that his remains were switched for somebody else's before this took place. The Acts of Attainder, which arguably experienced a high point in terms of their deployment during the reign of King Henry VIII, will drop off of a proverbial cliff when that reign comes to an end. Now, they will pop up occasionally in the following centuries, as we've just seen exemplified by that Act of Attainder that emerges at the very start of the reign of King Charles II. Nevertheless, they did gradually fall out of favour, and in the end, the capacity to strip a convicted traitor or felon of their lands and goods was abolished through the Forfeiture Act of 1870. But what do you think of Acts of Attainder, of how they were used, of whom they may have benefited? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comment section underneath this video, or you can find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to all the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box, so please consider following me over on some or all of them so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful, and if you did, please share it with your friends. Please also let me know you liked it by hitting the thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel, and if you think you're subscribed, I'm turning it into a little song now, if you think you're subscribed, maybe have a little check now. Just make sure that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you against your will. And while you're there, looking for that subscribe button, checking it, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please also hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down that's going to appear so that YouTube will tell you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.